My name is Debbie Clark. I'm the director of the Faculty Collaborative for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, and I'm also on the biology faculty. And I'm so pleased to see you all here for what I know is going to be a really timely and interesting topic. The Faculty Collaborative works on faculty development, but also connecting the university together. So today's event, which is called Scholarship Across the Disciplines, was the brainstorm of a brand new committee that works for the Faculty Collaborative, my scholarship committee, and that is Melissa Weiner and Eric Johnson and Nancy Bagatelle, who's disappeared somewhere. And so it was their idea to put together these, there she is, these interdisciplinary panels that cut across different schools and colleges here, different departments, and I'm so pleased that some of you have had this worked into your courses too. That's great. There will be two other Scholarship Across the Disciplines presentation. On October 29th, there'll be a panel discussion on women in society, and on November 12th will be a discussion on aging. So I hope that that might interest some of you. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric Johnson, who's going to tell us about today's panel.
Hello. Okay, that works. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm from the Department of Economics. Just one quick correction. Not that we just found this out. We changed it. It's not women in society anymore. It's women in politics. So it's going to be a little more focused discussion. So, all right. We have a great panel for that. So I highly encourage you to come in October. But today we're going to be doing the perspectives on the Gulf Coast disaster, and we have three panel members. The first person to talk is going to be Lisa Kaplan, an associate professor of biology here at Quinnipiac. Her research in general is on the effect of environmental contamination on aquatic wildlife. So that was actually what she was doing before the spill. So she's pretty qualified to talk about the impacts of this on biological systems. The next person to talk is the Say-Chini Chair in International Economics from the Department of Economics, Christopher Ball. And he's going to talk about the macroeconomic effect of the spill on the economy. And finally, Melissa Weiner, Associate Professor of Sociology, Assistant. She's good. All right. Her research is on the racial inequality and its effect on education. However, her research of social inequality goes a lot further, and she'll be talking about how the impacts of this that resulted from the oil spill. And she'll also give some advice on how people can mobilize and make sure that they're able to combat some of the social ills that have occurred as a result. So, after stumbling through that, I'll introduce our speaker. And the first one is Lisa Kaplan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here to speak with you about some perspectives on oil and the Gulf Coast disaster, along with my two colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here to do that today. I'm going to offer you a perspective that is a biological perspective. It's certainly not the only perspective, nor is it the only biological perspective. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. In terms of the oil well disaster, it's important to understand a little bit of background, very minimal, about what happened in the Gulf Coast. First of all, there was drilling to tap into the Macondo oil reservoir that began in 2009. And there are several names that get flung around, one of which is Macondo well number 252. That is the well upon which the rig sat, and the rig is what actually ended up exploding. It's also known as API well number 6817-44169. So when you look things up, they sound really different. It's all the same place. Transocean is a corporation who specializes in deep sea drilling, and they have several oil rigs, and one of their biggest, largest workhorses in the oil rig community happened to have been the Deepwater Horizon rig. And that rig took over for a predecessor, a previous rig, in January of 2010. Unfortunately, for so many different reasons, on April 20th, an explosion destroyed the Deepwater Horizon oil rig at the Macondo well site. If we fast forward quite a bit, around September 17th, BP, the company responsible for that particular well, released evidence that its containment capping stack of Macondo 252 was actually functioning. By September 18th, the well was permanently sealed. And on or around the 19th or 20th, depending on which agency you look at, accomplished by bottom kill, the well was declared dead. And that was official, so it's permanently sealed with a mile of concrete that got poured down. What were the immediate impacts of this explosion? The immediate impact of the explosion was that several individuals, 11 in total, lost their lives. And the individuals who lost their lives all had names and families, and were all very important to not only their coworkers and community, but also to their families as well. What I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you the names of the 11 individuals who perished. Oftentimes in the media we say 11 people died, and in today's society it sounds terrible to say 11 people died, but when you say names like Gordon Blair and Manuel Dewey and Revit Shane and Rashoda Weiss and the other individuals who passed away, they become people, and that is something that a lot of their friends and family have objected to, especially when you talk about a biological perspective. How can a pelican be more important than my son, my brother, my husband, my father? And so that's something to keep in mind as we look at this biological perspective. In addition to that terrible immediate loss, there were 115 survivors of that explosion who also suffered greatly. Countless family, friends, co-workers, communities in general, from the towns to the states to the nations that were directly and indirectly impacted. Businesses in terms of economics and corporate structure were also impacted, and then ultimately the environment. As I discuss the biological perspectives, what I want you to keep in mind is that in no way do I imply that any of these other impacts are less than. In fact, one might argue that on a generalized scale, when we like to put things in a pecking order, sometimes that's impossible to do. And so when we look at this, please understand that depending on what your personal perspective is, all of these things are equally important to a lot of people. What I want to talk about now is what about all the oil that was released between the explosion, which is typified by the picture on the left, and the permanent sealing of the well, and this is actual capture from BP's underwater camera. How much oil was released into the Gulf of Mexico? Depending on what reports you read, anywhere from 4 to 5 million barrels. 4 to 5 million sounds like a lot, but a million barrels of something doesn't sound too terrible in some respects. It actually is around 160 to 200 million gallons. That is a tremendous amount. Where is that oil and where has it been? Well, it did form a surface oil slick, and much of that now has evaporated. It has gone from a liquid phase to a gas phase and been transported around by air currents. Some of it dissolved into tiny droplets, which then sunk a little bit below the surface of the water. Some of it sunk even further and formed an underwater plume that has either started to disperse, is well into dispersal, or has completely degraded, depending on which report you look at. There is also the coastline, specifically of Louisiana. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration did a survey, and the dates of the survey are August 31st, so that's the last time they published it. Another one's scheduled to come out September 31st, so we're just a little early today to give this presentation. But of the 1,796 miles of coastline, 35 miles as of the end of August were heavily contaminated with oil. 71 miles were moderately contaminated with oil, and about 115 miles were lightly contaminated with oil. And it's maybe difficult with this lighting, but if you look at this picture, you can actually see the extensive oil slick going well beyond the containment buoy set up by that tiny little tugboat that's in your lower corner of the picture. All right, so if we talk about barrels and gallons and millions, what does that actually mean? Well, there was an interesting online article put forward by CBS that said, we're going to go with the number 4 million. 4 million barrels of oil leaked into the Gulf. And the Gulf contains approximately 643 quadrillion gallons of water. That's an actual real number, a real word. And they then put forth the idea that the oil that spilled into the Gulf of Mexico is roughly equivalent to spilling 3 cans of beer in the Louisiana Superdome. Now, to anyone who hears that initially, that sounds like, how much can that possibly be? That's such a tiny amount compared to the vastness of the ocean, a tiny amount compared to the vastness of the Superdome. Unfortunately, this type of logic is somewhat lacking in total critical thinking, which is one of the things that science and non-science individuals appreciate and laud, especially at a university. This goes reminiscent to something that was very popular prior to the 1970s, which is the solution to pollution is dilution. If I dilute it away and don't see it, therefore it must be gone. That's the equivalent to putting the blanket over your head when you're little to pretend like the boogeyman isn't in the closet. Whether he is or isn't, the blanket isn't going to change that, you just don't see it. That type of thinking is absolutely unconscionable in this day and age. It is oversimplification to the point of error, and it infantilizes our society, thinking that you can't see through that. What is important is what substance actually entered the water. Where specifically did it spill? Which creatures are in that area, and what are they doing at that time? When did the spill occur? All of these things are going to impact. If I can go back to the CBS's analogy of the 3 cans of beer in the Louisiana Superdome, if I spill it on a walkway, not such a big deal. If I pour it down the quarterback's throat, it may impact the game. If I actually pour it down the throat of a 4-year-old, not advocating any of these things, obviously, that's going to have an even greater impact. Clearly, you can see that just making an analogy of a ratio between 3 cans of beer and a Superdome isn't quite telling you the truth, even for their own idea. Okay? So, as far as the biologist is concerned, I am looking at some initial environmental concerns. The first concern is that crude oil has a complex composition and is toxic or poisonous. We have to look at it that it's going to behave differently when it's on the surface of the water, when it's going to form a plume of tiny little drops below the water, and then to add insult to injury, as it's weathered, as it ages out in the water, it's going to change. And what do those changes bring? Because it does persist for protracted periods of time. Second to that, about the substance itself, I'm going to be interested to see who was in the area at that time and who normally lives there. Are there threatened or endangered species? Because they are at significant risk. I'm also going to care, however, about the other animals and plants that might not be threatened or endangered, because there are food webs and population structures that are going to be important in terms of balance and productivity. And finally, last but not least, I am going to be concerned if this is not a out far in the ocean phenomenon, because substances do scroll in, and where they scroll in is to coastline. And on coastline, you have specific sensitive ecosystems that are very important not only to a biologist, but to an economics professor or a sociology professor, somebody who's involved in business. We'll talk about that in a second. Let me begin by just doing a very quick, don't worry so much about the words, but worry more about the message. Crude oil and refined oil, crude is what comes out of the ground. We separate it out by heating it and cracking it and distilling it. We get things like paraffin wax and kerosene and aeronautics fuel and the gasoline that goes in your car and the oil that goes in your tank. All this stuff comes out of crude oil. It actually has thousands of compounds, crude oil. The gasoline consists predominantly of things that are 100 pieces long. It's called 100 long hydrocarbon. Middle and heavy grade fuels and crude oil have thousands of hydrocarbon long units. It's incredibly big stuff. In addition to these things, they also have other organic compounds that aren't very good for any living creature. The compounds vary widely in how long they stay in the environment, in their degree of toxicity or how poisonous they are. They also vary in terms of concentration, composition, and the environment that they happen to be spilled in. The relative concentrations of the hydrocarbons vary widely, whether you're talking about crude oil or refined oil or residual products that might be coming off of some processes that have been currently going on in the Gulf. The hydrocarbon composition changes rapidly once it's released into the environment. There's a process called weathering that can turn a boulder into gravel. The same process weathers the oil and changes it. And this change oftentimes results in things that are far more poisonous than the original crude oil that went into the water. So the fact that it's been in there for any period of time is of concern. But basically, the other component to this is, what is the gravel? What is the sediment underneath where the oil has spilled? This is going to be very important, and this is what separates the Exxon Valdez in Alaska situation from this current issue in the Gulf Coast. It's what's on the bottom. Okay, that's actually going to matter quite a bit. Overall, though, no matter what you look at, determining the risk of injury and the probability of harm from the concentration of tens and possibly thousands of individual types of compounds that are in petroleum is very, very complex, and it's very, very costly. You need to look at each compound, and then pairwise, you need to compare what happens when the two compounds are paired up, until ultimately you have a matrix of 1,000 compounds. That is more than one lifetime's worth of work. So it is obviously very complicated. That's what gives us 100 different impressions about what's going on. It's complicated. There's 100 different ways to look at the same data. Just very quickly, what I wanted you to focus on in this particular slide is that when the oil lands on the bottom or floats on the top, wind and waves are going to reposition it. And when it gets down to the bottom, it forms a film over the bottom substrate. And in that film are bacteria that can actually consume the oil as a fuel for themselves. And that's the famous oil-eating bacteria. Those do exist, and they have been behaving very well and doing far better than what scientists had predicted, so that's quite nice. But the big black dots in that large enlarged picture, that's the oil. And that's going to persist and exist for protracted periods of time at smaller and smaller sizes to the point where it's very, very difficult to see. That may make people think it's gone, but it's not necessarily gone. It's kind of just enclosed in the silt that is the bottom of the ocean. So that's something to kind of keep in mind about the crude oil that spilled. Threatened and endangered species that may have existed in that area or used that area for breeding grounds, they are going to be of special interest to a biologist because if they are threatened, it means that their population numbers have been dropping steadily. And if those numbers continue to drop, they could move into an endangered situation. So this is a threatened species is kind of a heads up. Something's going wrong, fix it before it gets too bad, okay? An endangered species, the indication is that the organism will soon be headed towards extinction if nothing is done. That calls for a radical overhaul. Some endangered animals are bred in captivity and released back into the wild. That takes a long time and a lot of effort with sometimes only marginal success. We've had great success, by the way, with bald eagles, but it's far less success in terms of some of the pelicans and a lot of the fish. So we are concerned if those species exist in that area. What species are in the Gulf Coast? The least tern, the bluefin tuna, the brown pelican, the bottlenose dolphins, 4 of the sea turtle species that are threatened and or endangered, plus 7 other threatened or endangered organisms. Why are they at specific risk to this type of contamination compared to other birds and other fish and other reptiles? Well, because least terns fish along the beach, and that's where the oil washes up, and now they're consuming fish that are encased in oil. Bluefin tuna have breeding and feeding areas right where the major slick occurred and persisted for a matter of weeks. The brown pelican is the state bird of Louisiana. It spends most of its time floating out where the oil is, and when the oil coats their wings, they are no longer buoyant. They can't float on the water anymore, so they start to sink. They expend so much energy, they either drown or they wash ashore and die. So that's pretty significant. Bottlenose dolphins calve in that area, and young are going to be affected. And the sea turtles basically munch on everything and anything. So they're going to suck up whatever's coated in oil, thinking, ooh, a tasty treat, and it'll get down before they realize that wasn't a good decision. Okay, so these are all critters that we are very concerned about because their population numbers have either rapidly fallen or at very low levels. Then there are the lesser appreciated species. These are things like jellyfish, crabs, insects, and mollusks. They're not threatened, they're not endangered, they're not cute, they're not necessarily cuddly. People have a hard time identifying with them. The image on your left is a jellyfish mired in oil. Most of you might get a tear in your eye if it were a dolphin, possibly a bird, but I don't see anybody weeping for the poor jellyfish. So the reality is they get overlooked fairly regularly, but they're an important member of the overall stability of that environment, so that's also very, very critical that they're getting impacted. Little tiny hermit crabs over here on the right, they're also impacted. Most people ignore their existence, but they also have a very important function in the whole dynamic of the community. And then last but not least, things that most people never see unless they carry a microscope around, the plankton, the tiny microscopic phytoplankton and zooplankton that exist at the surface and just below the surface of the water column. They are the workhorses of any marine environment because they are the ones, the phytoplankton, that trap solar energy and convert it into chemical energy, and then everybody else feeds off of them. The small things get eaten by the big things that get eaten by the bigger things until ultimately you have the complex fish and the complex reptiles that you have in the ocean environment. All of it rests on the health and maintenance of what's going on the surface. So that's also important. In terms of crude oil toxicity, I've had friends tell me, who are not biologists or scientists by any stretch, and they're still my friends, that, oh, it's all overblown, this is job security for you, it's not that bad, how do you know? Well, my answer very sweetly most of the time is Exxon Valdez, Breyer, Sea Empress, Nakahoda, Erica, Prestige, and Tasman Spirit. They are all oil spills that have occurred along the same level of magnitude of what we're facing in the Gulf. within that general area of very large, very rapid, very big. There's plenty of field evidence that oil is not good for the local community, whether it's humans or other animals or plants. It impacts breeding, the ability to reproduce. It decreases the survivability of your young. It causes dehydration and emaciation in birds, which ultimately leads to their death or their inability to reproduce. The stress of contact with the crude oil causes immune function depression, which leaves you open to becoming sick and actually dying from things that wouldn't normally kill you. Those things that hold true for animals potentially could hold true for us. And so this is something that is incredibly important. And there are plenty of relevant studies that indicate this. The impact on the environment, besides the individuals suppressing your immune system, making you unable to reproduce, making you feel lethargic, there's also a larger impact. And that impact on the environment really focuses on hitting hard the producers and the consumers, those that capture solar energy and convert it into a fuel for other animals to live off of, and then those animals that consume that fuel. The fact that phytoplankton and zooplankton reside in the area where the oil is and has been is of extreme importance, because that means that that level of the food chain and the food web has been impacted. It is all interrelated. So if you take the bottom of a pyramid away, the rest falls down. If you take the foundations of your house away, the house falls down. If you take the foundations of a food chain or a food web away, those above it will ultimately begin to tumble. That's because everything is interrelated. The other issue associated with this, the food chain and food web component, is something called population structure and the domino effect. In terms of population structure, in any population, you can divvy them all up into pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive organisms. Where has the oil hit hardest? It is hit hardest at the pre-reproductive, the young, and the reproductive, because they're not able to do that. So who does that leave in the population? Predominantly post-reproductive, those who can't replace themselves when they die. This is a problem because in terms of populations, it means that you have the distinct possibility of having what's called a declining population, one that begins to shrink in numbers. And as a population shrinks in numbers, whether they are pre-reproductive or post-reproductive individuals, there are fewer and fewer individuals to procreate, which means the gene pool gets smaller and smaller, which means your probability of mating with something closely related to you goes up. And that's called inbreeding depression. In the fish world, what we say is nothing good comes out of that. You get crooked little weird fish who don't do what they're supposed to do. And so you can envision that if we have a decline spiral in terms of population numbers, and you have a decline spiral in terms of reproduction and the ability to replace what you've lost, all you're going to do now is cause a further and further and further decline. That is the domino effect. That's particularly scary when it happens in an estuary. And the reason it's scary when it happens in an estuary is because an estuary where freshwater and saltwater meet, which is the coast of almost every place in the US, they're highly productive ecosystems. They serve as a nursery habitat for 75% of all commercial fishes. That means everything that they're catching on the big canneries out in the ocean, all the big fish, all the tuna that ends up in a can or a bag, all of the cod, all of the bluefish, everything that is sold on the market, they start out in an estuary where they hide and grow up and then can make it once they get out in the big bad world of the ocean. Okay? So if you are impacting the nursery, you are significantly impacting the replenishing of what we are rapidly taking out of the ocean already. If you're not into animals and you don't really care about fish, there's also valued real estate that exists on the coastlines, which has now plummeted. For some individuals, this real estate is their nest egg, and now that's gone because their home is now worth almost nothing. If you look at recreational use and the dependence that towns and states and communities and businesses have on tourism, ecotourism, and vacation rental, that also has dropped, and I'm sure you'll be hearing along those lines as well. So estuary communities, whether you think they're beautiful or important biologically, they have a huge impact when we tend to destroy them. So what does it all mean? From a biological perspective and my perspective, which kind of mush together, I think you could find other biologists who might think a little bit differently, hopefully not too differently. Oceans and estuaries are very valuable resources. They are not things to be overlooked or dismissed or looked at as inconsequential. Our dependence on fossil fuel, the breakdown product of dead and decaying animals from a long time ago, has distinct associated risks with it. And the outcome, unfortunately, of what has transpired since October 20th is one of those risks. Luckily, the issues that have happened in the Gulf are potentially less dire than what happened in 1989 in Alaska. That is because the Gulf is warmer. The bottom sediments don't hold the oil nearly as tightly as the Alaskan sediments do. A tremendous amount of dispersing agent was used, an unprecedented amount of dispersing agent was used in the Gulf. And that was very different than the other spills. And the fact that it occurred at a time of year when hurricanes and strong winds and currents change helped to further disperse the oil in the Gulf Coast. You didn't have that advantage in Alaska. That's good news. That doesn't mean that the impact in the Gulf is inconsequential. What it means is it could potentially be less bad than Alaska, but bad is still bad. Potentially long-lasting effects can happen in terms of population dynamics, organismal behavior, and estuary productivity in the Gulf. Sadly, the recent studies that have been released, and there are multiple studies that have been released, suggest that rescue and treatment efforts with wild animals, specifically birds, mussels, and fish, do not necessarily restore them to breeding conditions. You may have saved the individual, but they won't be able to reproduce, and therefore the population is not saved or rescued. That doesn't mean you shouldn't save and rescue and treat the individuals, but remember, as a biologist, we have to think about individuals and then we have to think about populations. Saving the individuals doesn't necessarily mean you scored a home run. It doesn't mean you fixed it at the next layer up. The good news is that there are a couple of different studies, one I particularly liked in a peer-reviewed journal, that the dispersant that was used, some people are very concerned about that. This study suggests that the dispersant doesn't make things worse. Depending on how you look at the data, either oil plus dispersant was equally bad as oil by itself, or oil plus dispersant was less bad. So either it's equal or it's less bad, but it's not worse. That's the happy news about using the dispersant. So it depends on how you look at the data. Overall, however, the one major point that I want to bring out is, because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Because the impacts aren't immediate doesn't mean that they're not going to show up. These things do persist, and they do morph and change in the environment, and now you're dealing with a whole new set of chemicals and a whole new set of outcomes. It is very, very difficult and very, very challenging to predict what will happen. But if you use critical thinking, you use the past oil spills, and you use the data that's given, it indicates that while not the worst case scenario, profound and sustained impact has occurred in the Gulf because of the crude oil spill that resulted from the explosion of the oil rig. Okay? So that is what I have to share. These are the citations. I'm assuming that you'll have access to them at some point when it's put somewhere on the blackboard. So I'd be more than happy to talk with you after, and you'll have access to these things when you need them. And I do sincerely apologize that the other individuals whose lives were lost for whatever reason didn't come up in that other pane. That does actually bother me quite a bit, but that will be fixed by the time it's loaded onto the Blackboard shell. Okay? Thank you.
So my name is Chris Ball. I'm in the economics department, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I was asked to talk about the economic impact of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and I was glad you explained some of these other companies that show up that I wasn't sure exactly of their relationship. It is not my normal area of research, and I was asked to talk a little bit about sort of the macroeconomic implications. And economists, as many of you know, may or may not know, are often called the dismal scientists, because we're usually the ones saying all kinds of horrible things. And today I almost feel like I'm the positive spin, because it's very hard to pick up some of the economic effects of what is clearly a horrible event. And I think, like everyone, I watched from April until through the summer, and just every time you turn on the TV, you'd think, you're kidding, they still haven't stopped that thing. And you turn it back on a week later and you think, you're kidding, that thing is still gushing. And when they put the little video camera down there and you could see it, you just thought, this is unbelievable. Nevertheless, my job today was to look at the economic effects, and again, in terms of, you know, the initials for this are SAD, right? Scholarship across the disciplines. Which may fit our topic today. Being interdisciplinary, you get to see a little bit of sort of how an economist just approaching this question would start, and some natural questions that I ask, and hopefully you learn something and you're free to ask whatever questions you like. So I wanted to put a brief timeline up partially because I'll try and highlight some of the periods in the data from the spill, and I couldn't quite remember when it started. It started on April 20th. Since we'll look at some of these graphs, it did start April 20th. They finally capped it sometime in July 20th, and the final death of the rig was in September, but my understanding is the final period of pouring into the ocean was July 20th. She's also right, we were sort of not joking, but discussing before we started talking, and as you look around, it's really hard to find data on what the effects are right now. And part of that's just that this is very, very fresh. So when you talk about macroeconomic data, it's even worse. We don't have accurate data on what happened 6 months or a year ago on the economy. You're still updating those numbers in general. So something this fresh, it was actually really hard to find data on the effect of those industries locally, on the effect of the crab industry and so on. So I've done what I could. The estimate that I found, I tried to pick some that were in the middle as I looked around, was about 4.9 million barrels of crude, which coincided more or less with what you had. And I consistently found that this is the largest accidental marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. So even though she cited a number of them, he's shaking his head that that's not true. Apparently this is a larger of them. I remember the Exxon Valdez, and I think people will certainly remember this. Macroeconomic effects. Well, what do we look at in macroeconomics? We look at some of the aggregate effects of this. They're actually really hard to measure right now for two reasons. One is that oil from the Gulf is a small fraction of the world oil supply, and thus it may have no noticeable impact at the aggregate level. Also the case for the economic impact on fish, oyster, and blue crab markets. So she's absolutely right. It's devastating to many of these markets, and that tends to be a local effect. And the reason is, and I tried to find better information on how large some of the fish, oyster, and blue crab supply from the Louisiana area is, or from the Gulf Coast in general, and it's very hard to ascertain. But I do look at some of the effects of the oil. It's a fraction of global supply, so it doesn't have a large effect on the global markets. That's not to say we don't care, it's just in trying to measure it, it's hard to come up with any aggregate effect. The second problem was, as you probably know, we're in the middle of a recession, although the official date of the final recession was in June by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Any of you that are seniors looking for jobs this year will be sure we're still in the depth of a recession. It makes it really hard to find effects from the oil spill in macro data because we're having such a bad time already that they're really dwarfed or dwarfing the effects from the oil spill in the macro data. To put things in perspective, and here's where I started looking up some of the numbers, the average US crude production in 2009 was 5,360,000 barrels a day, okay? OPEC, which is the petroleum cartel, is 29 million barrels a day. So the two together, which is a first pass guess at the global supply, although it still doesn't cover it all, is about 34 million barrels a day, which means the BP spill was around 57,000 barrels a day, which is very, very minuscule in the grand scheme of global oil markets, okay? It's about 1% of U.S. production, the spill. It's about 1% of U.S. production, and it would be less than 1% of global production. So it's not easy to see in the data at all. If here's U.S. production, you can see it drop off. So, I'm told not to walk away from the microphone because we're recording and we didn't bring pointers. But the yellow area is more or less when the spill occurred. And you can see an effect because it is a 1% change in the drop-off in oil production in the United States. So clearly it had an effect. If the previous graph is an important decline in the market supply of oil, we should see something like a price increase in the world supply of oil or the U.S. spot price of oil, right? So if we cut back on production, we would expect to see some kind of price effect from that. But we actually see the opposite. So this is where, in part, the recession is just throwing everything into a sort of a whirlwind these days. So that period is again, yeah, that should be right, is again the period of the major part of the oil spill. And you would expect to see the price of crude going the opposite way if this was having a big effect. And by chance, it was absolutely going the other direction at the time. So any effect that it was having on oil prices maybe prevented a small drop, but it was dwarfed again. So economically speaking, it didn't have a large impact on that. So what was the total value of the oil that we lost? So the average price is about $73 a day for that period. Total oil was spilled was about 4.9 million barrels. And so therefore the total value of what was spilled was $357 million. We don't want to forget that we do need oil, and we need it for many things. We can debate whether we want to move on to other alternative energies, which we hopefully will one day. But this is oil that was going to be out in the market, and it's certainly value lost. This ignores the foregone cost of any additional supply that would have come from successful rigs. And now there's a moratorium, and that's also going to prevent this. And we're going to be more cautious in the future, which will also prevent more spills, but it's going to affect the supply of oil. And so perhaps that'll speed up alternative energy investment. I don't know. We don't have crystal balls either, so it's very hard to predict. So I looked at the effect nationally at the GDP. Again, because it's so fresh, we don't have monthly data for this late. So I looked at personal incomes, which is a good proxy. I looked at real and nominal personal income. And this is the period for the spill, and you again don't pick up a very large effect. So from a macro perspective, it's not very big. Unemployment, this is around 10%, and that period you would not want to conclude that the oil spill actually lowered unemployment. It's just, again, we're in a recession and finally unemployment's hopefully starting to decline. That happened to coincide with the period of the oil spill, but there's not much of a relationship there. Unemployment in Louisiana, however, we should have more of an effect on. Again, data is very hard to get, and it's also going to be convoluted if you look for data on the effect in Louisiana. And the reason is you've got two things going on. You've got unemployment going on because of the industries closing, but you have simultaneous efforts to clean up, which are hiring lots of boaters and hiring a lot of people to get out there and clean up. So they're adding jobs. You don't want to conclude that the added jobs are positive in adding to the recovery. It does minimize the negative effects on the economy, but those are people who should be doing other more productive uses of their time. They should not be out there cleaning up oil. So even that increase in employment isn't, I don't want to interpret it as a positive thing. But you can definitely see that there was a tick up in unemployment in Louisiana around the time of the spill when everything sort of shut down, okay? And this is the latest data that you can get from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it does have a somewhat significant, it was dropping down to almost 6.6%, and it spiked all the way back up to over 7% in the Louisiana area. And that, of course, will have a broader economic impact as well over time. So it was very hard to find an aggregate effect, and it's very hard to answer the question of the economic effect because much of it is simply unmeasurable. How do you measure and find out the contracts that would have been in the area for people to work that would have happened if this hadn't occurred? You'll never find data on observables like that. I did look at some of the direct economic impact. So the Obama administration has, at the time that I put this together earlier this week, has sent 6 bills to BP, thus far totaling about $518 million. Billion. That should be billion. Sorry, I dropped it out. BP has so far paid all 5 and is planning to pay the last. The BP has declined federal support to lighten this burden, so if anyone knows more about this, apparently there's a federal law that allows for spills not to be entirely financed by the company that did the spill. So there's some cap on that, which I was a little surprised. As an economist, you'd like that company to bear the full burden of the cost in order to discourage future companies from doing the same. But it was interesting to me that BP actually declined the federal support from what I read. And I'm sure that's because they're trying to keep their image, because people are pretty much hate them. Alabama's claims, I grew up down on the coast. I'm actually from Alabama, lived in New Orleans. My grandparents live in the Panhandle, and Alabama's claim to BP was for $140 million in lost tax revenue. So again, these are things that would have occurred that didn't. So they lost tax revenue because estimated that workers would suffer a further $824 million in lost earnings. And that's just from the slice of the Mobile and Baldwin counties down closest to the Gulf. So these do have large effects for local municipalities. If they're losing tax revenues, that's because local people are out of jobs, or because local businesses are not able to sell things and are closing down themselves. So it's just an indication, it's sort of a tip of the iceberg indication of some of the localized costs that this spill has had economically. I'll make one other point, that these don't only represent environmental costs. So the amount that the BP is paying for all of this, and again, that doesn't just represent money that's a cost to BP. Those are dollars that should be used somewhere else productively in our economy and our society. Instead, they're being used to clean up this horrible spill. And they should be used to clean up the spill, but we would much rather the spill not have occurred and then be used somewhere else. Further compensation, based on some of the upper estimates of the oil spill, BP and others could be fined a further up to $5.4 billion for violating water pollution laws, or up to another $21 billion if gross negligence is found. Again, immediately, these are funds that should be put to better use. If they are found, at least you can argue that those are high costs that hopefully deter future potential violators. Louisiana has demanded a further $75 million from the oil giant to help the market in Louisiana's seafood and tourism industry. So again, I looked down for the tourism and seafood industries and couldn't find any data on the effects locally. And so this, again, I think you should take as a tip of the iceberg estimate for the cost to that local industry. Alabama's claim so far, whoops, I already had that. This is the effect on BP's, and I have to thank our other panelist, Eric Johnson, for sending this to me. This is the effect on their price, their stock price. So the red line, and you can see it, is what the overall Standard & Poor's, you can think of just the market, Dow Jones or whatever, is doing, and that's what happened to BP. And you can probably guess where the spill occurred right at the beginning of that big drop. So they're certainly taking a beating, not that we feel too sympathetic for them. So they are taking a beating in the stock market. They are losing some gasoline sales, and apparently I couldn't find that either. I looked around, hard to estimate. Luckily, the spill, if I can be positive about things, seems to have been, from an economics point of view, purely a localized economic effect. It doesn't seem to have affected the aggregate economy at all, although it is hard to measure. Economic costs are mostly in terms of lost production in the area, allocation of funds away from alternative, more production uses, and one of the best deterrents, in my opinion, is for future spillers, is the loss of profit and reputation to spill companies. Exxon and BP are now household names for a very bad reason. Most companies don't want to have that experience, and we don't want them to have that, and we want them to fear that and thus not pollute or have spills. So the list of costs plus the drop in the stock price is about all you can say about the damages to them, although their profits are hurt some as well, although they're still quite a profitable company. So I'll conclude my comments. It's something of a macroeconomics. I can't pick up much, and it is indeed a small fraction of the overall aggregate economy, but it seems to be very hard locally, and much of the costs are being borne by local people, local governments, and BP. And while we don't care about BP paying it, we do care that those are resources that should be used elsewhere. So thank you very much.
My name is Melissa Weiner. I'm a sociologist here in the sociology department, and this is a little outside my area of expertise. I study generally stratification and inequality, mostly in the context of education, but also globally. So this was actually kind of fun for me to pull together some of this data, although sociologists are also considered one of these doom and gloom professions, and so fun might be, I'm kind of using that word fast and loose because it's kind of not super uplifting, what I have to say. So as I often say, sociologists don't predict the future. What we can do is we can suggest possible consequences of this phenomena based on existing social facts and then analysis of similar past events. So I have some data, like my colleague said, it's very difficult to find some of this data right now because it's just too new. And I have to say you both did a great job setting me up, so thank you so much for that. That's wonderful. And so sociologists, what we do in any event like this one is we ask, what about the people? And so what a lot of us are really interested in is what's going on with the people. How is something that happened in one social institution going to affect another social institution? And so one of the first things I want to mention, much as Dr. Kaplan did, is in asking about what about the people, there were 11 people who lost their lives, there were 115 who were injured, there are the thousands of people living in the region, everyone else in the nation. And this is not really what I'm going to focus on, but if you're looking at what about the people, not only is it the people that are going to be affected, but the people that caused this is also have to be looked at. And I would imagine that if any one of you or I took a plane down to the Gulf, stood on a beach, killed 11 people, assaulted 115 others, and then dumped hundreds of millions of barrels of oil into the ocean, you'd probably face some sort of social consequence. You probably wouldn't ever see the light of day ever again. It's questionable what's going to happen to the executives in these companies, whether or not they're going to face any kind of social consequences, particularly in the form of jail terms. We've seen that traditionally white-collar crime, corporate crime, where people die on a work-related accident, usually don't face any kind of similar sanction. I think it's important to recognize that. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the starting points for this situation. We can't predict the future until we know what's going on at that time. So when the explosion happened and the oil started to leak, one of the things that you saw that existed within the Gulf Coast communities is many of these they were small, tight-knit, long-standing communities, which is actually probably going to help them in trying to get some kind of resources and benefits from these companies. And we'll come back to that at the end. They had the lowest average income nationally of any region. So these are places that were already experiencing economic hardship. For example, the average income in Louisiana is only 2/3 that of Connecticut. In addition, they also have very low levels of educational attainment. Most of the folks that are in these jobs, such as shrimpers and fishermen, they're like 5th generation. Many of them don't have college degrees. Some of them don't have high school degrees. These aren't skills that can be transferred to something else. This is what they do. And so that's important to recognize. We also saw that overall, except for Louisiana, unemployment in the Gulf states was higher than in many other states around the nation. And then finally, this was a region that has already been hit really hard 5 years ago, or 4 years ago, 5 years ago, did I get that? 5 years ago. With the existing social and economic devastation of Hurricane Katrina. So these are folks that are already reeling from these things, and some folks had really just started to get back on their feet. Other people weren't quite back on their feet yet. So the immediate social effects. The working poor are the most affected in this. Right now, it's one-fifth of the people in the Gulf Coast area, especially on the shoreline, are experiencing some form of income loss. And of those people, the majority of those were making under $25,000 a year, which is roughly at the poverty line for a family of 4. So these were people that were living paycheck to paycheck to begin with, probably didn't have a whole lot of money stashed away in the case of any kind of crisis, so they're going to be very heavily hit. The industries that are affected, they're the ones that are most directly related, so seafood, tourism, also the wedding industry, and then small businesses and local chains, particularly those that cater to these folks. Right now, what we're seeing is that of people that are getting compensated by BP, the average is only 10% of what their permit costs. So in order to fish, you have to have a permit. So they're not getting compensated a whole lot, and their businesses now are virtually worthless. So many of them are now in the red, both with regard to their loss of income from actually being able to do their job, the loss of money that they spent on their permit, and then the fact that they're not making any money doing what they should be doing. So there's the income loss. Job loss. I found this. This was reported in the Wall Street Journal of estimated 100,000 jobs lost. Interestingly, only 23,000 are directly attributed to the spill. All the others are indirect. So these are people that are working in support industries for the fishermen. So it might be like the bait shops, the people that sell lunches to these people, all these other support industries. And then we're also seeing a decline in home values. Overall, 5 to 15% on average, whereas it's much larger in places where oil lingers on the shores outside the home. So as Dr. Kaplan mentioned, there were an awful lot of people, my father included, who bought a house on the shore in Florida, and he's really concerned because this is his nest egg, and if that house is worth nothing, then that's kind of a problem. And we saw also that home sales fell 25% between April and August. So that's what has happened. That's what we know. Potential long-term consequences. First, socioeconomic. We're likely to see the people that are working being paid by BP to clean up the shores. Those folks aren't going to be doing that forever. And so all these people that are technically still employed are going to be listed as unemployed very soon. The estimates are in the billions for the loss of income and economic growth by the end of the year. Again, we don't have actual data, but if you look at something like the fishing industry, this isn't just the Gulf Coast we're talking about. We're talking about the entire Atlantic. One of the things that we know is that, first of all, what is caught in the Gulf accounts for almost 1/2 of America's shrimp, oyster, crab, and crawfish that's eaten here. Shrimp is something that people actually now, this is the most commonly eaten seafood. It's more common than tuna. It used to be considered like fancy food for like wedding receptions. Now people eat more shrimp than anything else. And there's a concern that this might go back to being like a fancy food because we might not have it anymore. Because not only does the Gulf produce this, but it's also the spawning area for a lot of the seafood that's farmed and fished here in the Northeast. These fish travel down and spawn and then come all the way back up the shore. So this is a huge industry. We're talking about the entire eastern seaboard of the Atlantic Ocean. In addition, there's also the potential for the loss of tourism. The estimate is that this is a $100 billion industry that's now threatened. And the thing is, even if it's clean, and this is rightfully so, as Dr. Kaplan mentioned, just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. And so a lot of people, even if you can't see the ocean, they might not want to go because of the risk that there might still be stuff floating around in there that might not be so good for you. One of the really big concerns is population loss. As I mentioned, these are folks that, they might be 3rd or 4th or 5th generation fishermen. This skill is not transferable. And so they're probably going to leave to go somewhere else where they can get a job. And so as they leave and as they start to get more poor, it's going to become a chain reaction where other businesses are also going to go out of business. And so this is going to be everything from, car salesmen, insurance agents, hardware stores, grocery stores, all these mom and pop stores will probably be the ones that'll close down first. And then it's likely that large chains like Target, Walmart, Sam's Club, etc. will also leave as well because they just don't have a base to serve. And as this happens, there'll be less people paying taxes, which means that there'll be less money going to basically every public service like trash pickup, mail delivery, schools, libraries, etc. And so this is going to be likely a problem. Right now, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the folks living in the Gulf Coast, especially that rely on these industries, believe that they at some point are going to have to leave. So, yeah. One of the things that we also might see, as poverty goes up, crime also tends to go up. There's less options in the legal economy, so people start participating in the illegal economy. And if anything, this is only going to drive more and more people away. And so what we'll see then is this chain reaction, which can lead to the population of towns, especially the smaller ones. So I'm sorry, it's not a very bright picture I'm painting for you here. So that's the socioeconomic consequences. Health consequences are also potentially quite large. There's going to be minor, immediate, and then serious long-term, both physical and mental. So physical, there's potential airborne and waterborne pollutants, the oil, and clearly the oil dispersant maybe not as bad, but that could have long-term effects on lung, heart, reproductive health, and systems. If this oil winds up in the water or water supply and it's used to water the crops, and then those crops grow corn or whatever, wheat, soybeans, whatever, and we buy that stuff, then we also become contaminated. So this becomes a national issue, and we just probably don't know what might be caused. There also could be a rush to go back to some of these industries, like shrimping, for example. And if Congress allows for the fishing ban to be lifted because they don't see oil on the surface, then we could be fishing and shrimping in these areas where there's still pollutants. So that could cause a problem. So respiratory illnesses, cancers, skin diseases, reproductive system. Mental health also becomes a really, really big concern. In the wake of Exxon Valdez, local communities saw substance abuse rise, drinking increase, we saw marriages crumble, domestic violence, depression, and suicides also increased. The reason for this is because when people lose their jobs, they become less socially connected. And especially for people, if you're a fifth-generation fisherman, that's your identity. And if you don't have that anymore, you tend to get very depressed. Sociologists talk about it as anomie, where they feel disconnected and alienated, and they lack a connection to their larger community because they've lost their job. And so this can lead to depression, PTSD, et cetera. In the wake of Exxon Valdez, we saw mental health problem diagnoses ranging everything from depression to PTSD. They increased 360% within a 6-month period. And depression, not only can it lead to suicide, but it also affects children as well. One of the things that we're seeing with the current situation is that parents, if they're experiencing economic hardship and they want to get something from BP, they have to go to these BP claims offices. But these claims offices don't have child care centers. So what that means is that these kids are going into these meetings and hearing their parents cry about the situation that they're under, the stress that they're experiencing, and all the social consequences of that, and it can factor on, like it can be reproduced in the children. We also see that when parents get depressed, they spend less time with their kids, so a weekly outing to the park or something might go away. And kids of parents who experience depression also experience depression. But the way it manifests in children is usually in a form of acting out. So they tend to start getting into trouble, they get into fights, they start doing poorly in school, they might drop out. They might drop out otherwise to try to work as a way to make up for the money that their parents have lost from their business. So now we're seeing a multi-generational effect. It's likely domestic violence, substance abuse will also go up. Divorce tends to occur when people get depressed and these kind of events happen. Marriages become unstable, and then, like I said, depression and PTSD, and unfortunately suicide as well. And so what locals can do. One of the most important things, I believe, is to draw on these existing long-standing community ties and networks to organize to ensure that they get compensated both from the government as well as from the oil companies. One of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of money is being directed to the state government. How that money will get down to the actual people is really up in the air, and so it's important that people act together to be able to do this. Organize politically and legally for both individual benefits like health, salary, home compensation, and credits, and also for group benefits like job training programs. So for the people that want to stay in the area, but they can't, fish anymore, it would be great if there was a job training program that might retrain them to work in different industries that still exist. Community investment programs that would provide, for example, small business loans for people that want to start businesses so that they stay in the community might be another alternative. And then relocation services for people that do want to leave or feel that they have to leave. It's very expensive to move. I would imagine many of you have your parents drive you here when you come up here, but as someone who has moved, for example, from Minnesota to here, it's over $1,000. Like, it's not cheap to do that. And so if you have to move, it's actually very costly. And so to provide not only the actual move, but then help finding an apartment, help finding a job, that's something else that these folks could mobilize for. And so it's important that they look out for their short and long-term interest, especially if some of these health problems don't manifest for 10 to 15 years. Then what happens? So if you have little children that are playing on these beaches, and then suddenly we see that 15 years from now, none of them can have children because they have some kind of awful reproductive disease or cancer or something, what's going to happen? Is BP going to pay for it 15 years down the road? We don't know. So it's important that both short and long-term interests are acknowledged. And then just some larger consequences, and these are really some questions about local. So in New England, for example, we rely heavily on fishing, especially in parts of Massachusetts, along the shore, along the coast in Maine. This is an industry that's experienced economic decline to begin with, and it's possible that some of those folks that are from Louisiana, Alabama, et cetera, they might move up here for those jobs. So will that affect us in that way? And will there be fewer fish if they can't spawn in the Gulf? And then nationally, will there be legislation on oil drilling? As Professor Ball mentioned, right now there's a $75 billion cap, I believe, on how much oil companies are required to pay. There is now legislation to try to get that cap removed so that they actually have to pay for all of it. But will there be additional legislation on drilling, seafood, the tourism industry, or nationally that could affect these jobs? What about the food supply? Will costs for these foods go up? Will we see health problems related to them? What will this cost in terms of health care, jobs lost, stress, et cetera? Oil. Will there be fewer oil industry and related jobs as a result of this? Will BP stop drilling in the Gulf, allowing for fewer jobs for people that rely on that? Will all the money BP is spending be passed on to consumers in the form of higher gas and oil prices? And then jobs, given that we're already in a recession and now there's more people out of work, how will the national economy be affected by this? So that is my sad story of the Gulf BP oil.
Yeah, I know.
All right. I want to stand up and direct questions there.
So we'll now take questions for the panel.
The biologist. Why do we have to do anything for any species in this disaster? Like, why are we trying to, I guess, save them? And by extension, wouldn't this be kind of a good experiment for evolution?
That's actually a very interesting question. You can go with a more global perspective that humans are part of the animal kingdom, and since everything is interrelated, it would be nice if we kept everything in a productive, steady, stable balance. But let's just say you don't go for that argument. Let's say instead you want to know what's in it for me, and I want to know that. And what's in it for me is that humans as a species and then populations and communities of human beings rely very much on these creatures, not because they're warm and fuzzy and look like stuffed animals, but because they provide major economic contribution to us. And in our society, good, bad, or indifferent, that's very important. The other reason we worry about that is because diversity and normal population numbers equates to stability of our environment, and a terrestrial environment is already biologically hostile to begin with. It would be very nice if we can rely on food, if we can rely on economics, and if we can rely on overall health issues. So should we or do we care about this particular individual critter, whether it's a pelican or a dolphin or a sea slug? It doesn't matter, right? The answer to that could be yes or no. But on the larger context, do we care about a food chain and food web of which we are a part? I think absolutely, because if any of those pieces fall, the top comes crashing down, and we are one of the top pieces. So in a self-serving interest, we do need to care about them. In terms of the evolutionary perspective, there is macroevolution, which things go extinct and new things come online, and there is microevolution, things change in terms of your genetics. There are ample experiments that are not as disastrous to us as a species and not as disastrous to our global economies of other creatures that are more than set in terms of dealing with that. So there's multiple ways to look at it to try to look for any good. Does environmental perturbation upset balance? Yes. But we already knew that.
One more student here.
Yeah, Professor Kaplan, I had another question for you. You were talking earlier about the oversimplification in the spill, and then later you were talking about how factors helping us so it wasn't as devastating as the Exxon
That's actually a really good point. What I was saying is potentially it's not as bad as the Exxon Valdez. So that word in there, potentially, is really important. It's kind of like my get out of jail free card. Potentially it's not as bad. One of the problems with Alaska is that it is a very cold environment. That's not the issue. The issue is cold environments are less productive and less resilient and less resistant to environmental perturbation. So you can hit them and they break, as opposed to you hit them and they knock down like a weeble and get back up. So that's particularly difficult in that environment, okay? The reason why the Gulf potentially isn't as disastrous as the Exxon Valdez is because that dispersion takes it out of higher concentrations facing specific organisms in a specific region. You're 100% right. Spreading it around could be bad as well. I'm not saying that that makes it not bad, and I'm certainly saying that doesn't make it good, but it does change the dynamic. And so instead of having it stay in one spot and all of it wash up on shore, there was a plume that was generated that did allow it to have access to oil-eating bacteria that did diminish a portion of it. The winds and the currents did cause more of it to evaporate. Where it goes and where it's dispersed, that could be a whole new set of problems, but what it did is it mitigated the issues within the Gulf. The problem, in my little opinion, about biologists is everything is so complicated, you have to look at a tiny piece. And so you look at that tiny piece and you make predictions on that tiny piece. And I can pretend, like the kid with the blanket over his head, that I don't care about air currents because I do fish stuff. And I don't care about this, that, and the other thing. The reality is it goes somewhere. Conservation of matter says it doesn't disappear, it just changes location or state. So in my system, I have the luxury of looking at a system that I'm defining as closed. And anything gets out of there, I can ignore. But that's the only way you can really start to understand complicated things, is start with those little pieces. So you're dead spot on. Moving it somewhere else and pretending it doesn't exist, that doesn't work either. But what's happening preferentially in the Gulf could potentially be not as long-lasting as the 100 years issue associated with Alaska. That's what I really meant to say.
First of all, this gentleman said about the regulations, field regulations. As far as what I read and what I heard from the house, that it was that BP actually violated the regulations wherever they were. And also, I actually have a question to the economics people. I think first of all, I think part of one of the people here should discuss that. Should it be an engineer as well? Because BP actually came with a report according to which they actually shared the blame with Halliburton, Transocean, and the other contractors. There were also, I'll have to remind you, there were whistleblowers before the oil spill. There was data about BP's stocks, the value of their stocks. According to reports, after they issued the report on who is to be blamed, they shared the blame with Transocean and Halliburton and the other contractors. The value of their stocks went up. Your reaction, is it, was this report on purpose so that their stock go up? Is there any new research that should be done about it, and something that required?
And anyone else who wants to comment is welcome. Yeah, so I put that up there to show that it does hit the stock. Stock prices are very volatile. It's very hard to know what exactly affects them. I'm sure when the report issued, or I would say it this way, I'm sure when the findings came out that they would be able to link the other companies, and many of them are partially liable for making the rig and not ensuring that BP followed protocol, and it is a cooperative activity. I'm sure BP was relieved, and I'm sure they were eager to make sure that that was released in the press, and we're probably glad if it had a positive impact on the stock. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised at all. I don't read into that any conspiracy, but I'm sure it's true. Other than that, yeah, as I mentioned, they are having hearings for BP violating, openly violating, and they'll probably be taken to court, and I would assume that many of their violations would be looked at this point, but I don't know any of the details about that. The stock price is just a dramatic one-time effect. The reason I put it up there was because if I put profits up, they're still profitable. Their profits have been hit, but I couldn't find all of their latest profit earnings. So stock price is just a good indicator that clearly they took a sort of big punch to the stomach. But absolutely, I'm sure they were thrilled when they could link it up to other companies and spread it around. And they would also be thrilled if people forgot about it quickly as it disperses and washes away. And those bring up her problems that, you know, look, this is also, the economic effects will probably be relatively short term. I would guess that the effects in the New Orleans area will be longer term because they were still recovering from Katrina and were already down in terms of local infrastructure, and so those few people who had really hung on and stayed are now being hit with a double whammy. So it would probably be slower to recover there from the BP spill, but the economic effects will be slow, and they're both exactly right. The thing we forget is, you know, once we don't see it anymore, people will forget, and the media will move on to some other topic, and we'll go on. But yeah, I'm sure a regulation will be looked at, and I would assume that they will be better investigated. Does anyone want to?
You talk with engineers.
We don't have any engineers here.
Yeah.
Which one is more truthful?
It would be great to have. I mean, this is an interdisciplinary panel for that reason, but we don't have an engineering school at Quinnipiac. So, but it'd be great. I would love to have an engineer present and discuss. I learned a lot from both of these other conversations, so that's what we're here for.
What's the effect on BP now for the future? I mean, they're hit hard with a lot of fines, and obviously their image is very tarnished. Are they going to be broken up as a company, or, I mean, I imagine they're still very profitable.
We don't know the answer to that. Well, and we can have he's got a comment or a question here, but I would just to guess, Exxon is still here. Okay, so my guess is BP will be here. People will, again, the economic effects are fairly short term. People will, you know, quit buying from BP for a while, and then 2 years from now you'll find people stop at BP just the way they always did because it's located on the corner. So my guess is that they'll probably be around, barring that they find some major legal fiasco where they were clearly in, you know, at an Enron level of some kind of harm in terms of violating the law. They'll probably be around. They'll do a lot to maintain their image and try and recover from it. They'll probably donate every year to a Gulf Coast fund or something, but to be honest, my guess is they'll still be around, absolutely.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I mean, a lot of times I think, again, you know, the issue of profitability of the company, will it be broken up, but is anyone going to serve time for this? A lot of people are raising the question about how the Supreme Court ruled that corporations could be considered as people in terms of campaign contributions, so whether or not they would then be able to be considered people in terms of charging them with criminal liability, because usually they're brought to civil court rather than criminal court, and no one individual is held responsible and put them in jail. And so, you know, it would be interesting to see if we had a whole bunch of the executives brought into criminal court and charged with the murder and assault on, you know, a murder of 11 people and assault on 115 others, what would happen to the company? So just something to think about. It hasn't happened, but that law is recent. The law changing corporation into people, that just happened. And so now there's all these new doors open that people are thinking about taking advantage of. Historically, you could not charge a company with murder. You had to bring them to civil court, and they would maybe pay a fine. Sometimes there were small jail terms. I don't think there's been any jail term. Even in the S&P, I think it was the longest jail term was under 3 years. So, yeah.
Part of the issue is the company is not a person.
Right.
There's no, I mean, if the three of us are board of whatever company, it's a legal entity. We're not, it isn't a person. So BP itself, in many ways, doesn't exist. It's just a bundle of laws. And I think that's where the comment about Sarbanes-Oxley, one of the things it did was made accounting firms as a company, because again, it's just a bundle of laws, said, look, if you're going to be running that bundle of laws, then you're the person who's going to be responsible, and you need to sign your name there. And once you did that, you've made the legal step to say, I'm responsible. So a case for BP having to do that, or oil companies that are drilling having to do that, would then make, for future cases, those individuals responsible. And this change in the legal standing at the Supreme Court, I hadn't heard that, but it makes sense that it could change that. Sorry.
We have time for one more question. Yes. No.
Okay. I've been reading Oil on the Brain, and I was thinking about, as I was driving by BP the other day, that basically I'm boycotting, I'm not going to buy from these people. And then I was thinking about the stories about the people who run the gas stations who are not BP, and the impact on the people who truck the fuel. I mean, there's a huge sociological impact. If we talk about the families and the businesses in that area, but not the broader implications.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that many of these gas stations are actually franchises, and they're owned by individuals, many of whom are immigrants that are trying to get a foothold in this country, and now you have people boycotting them as if they actually did it, when they're really just trying to, give a better life to their children. And I think, this is part of the issue, is that, we don't always know how corporations are run and how this stuff really works and what's put out to the public about who's actually responsible. And so you're right, it will definitely, I mean, we have a BP right around the corner there, and I've gone in there and the guy is very nice, but clearly I don't think he had anything to do with this oil spill, and so we punish those people and their children. And it's funny, almost everywhere I've lived, in Boston and Minneapolis and here, there's been BPs right around the corner, and so these are fairly ubiquitous, and you have to think about all these people that are trying to make a living and how that's going to impact them and their family and their children and everything else. I think you're right, it's a really important point, and how this really is a national issue. This is not just those poor people that rely on fishing for their income. I mean, this really is a national issue. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thanks to the panel. It is Friday, so we can't stay late.